Hello, my name is Joanne Knight. Welcome to the barn. Today we're going to talk about how to audition some patterns on a quilt, but not the straight set that we usually talk about in class. A couple of weeks ago, I was playing with repeat patterns and figured out how you would set up a quilt on point. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I have this little quilt in front of me, and I want to show you the difference on angles in repeat patterns because a lot of times we don't get a chance to talk about those. There are two different angles. The first one is the pattern size angle. So if I type in a 45 and move my mouse to the screen, that means that every individual pattern will be put on a 45-degree angle or whatever angle that I put in there. So under the setup box in set pattern size, that angle refers to every single pattern in the repeat patterns. If I go down to set total size and type in a 45, that means that the entire quilt is set up on point. So in messing with these two areas of the repeat setup box, I started thinking about those quilts that we have that are on point quilts because we know how to set up a straight set, but we may not necessarily know how to set up an on point quilt. And in playing with that, this is what I discovered. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to go to a different quilt group, and I'm going to bring this block in by Nancy Hackey. The first thing that you need to know is what your measurement of your own point block is. If you're looking at your quilt and the block is like this, then you may not necessarily know what size to size your patterns. So if I am going to measure, and I'm going to do Alt-M for that, I'm in standalone, but I would be doing this on my quilt. I would measure from home plate all the way to first base. That's kind of the easiest way for me to understand how to do that. And that would tell you what the size of your block is. So let's go back and delete this one and let's set up our quilt. I'm going to go to Repeat Patterns, left click on that icon, and my reference point is upper left. So I am going to select the upper left, and I usually go by a grid point. I'm going to change this particular pattern to 12 inches. That is not what it measured, but just for argument's sake, that's what I'm going to do with this particular pattern. I'm going to close up some of my setup boxes. Let's take freeze aspect off and make it an even 12 inches. Close this box. And in this particular setup, I need to lock repeats and rows. You know how many repeats you have on the quilt because you can count them to see. So we're going to say that this particular quilt is a 4x4. Once I set those up, I'm going to go back to pattern size, and I'm going to tell CreativeStudio to give me a 45-degree angle, which then turns all of those patterns on point. I have to say OK before I select the next pattern, because if I select the next pattern, CreativeStudio is going to automatically change out these patterns and think that I'm not happy with it. So I'm going to say OK. Then I am going to change and select my second pattern, go back to repeat patterns, and my upper left is going to be the very center of the first repeat in the first row. Left click, change that pattern size to the same size at the first block is. Let's make it an even 12. and I am going to change that pattern to a 45 degree. Close up some of my setup boxes, lock my repeats and rows, and I am just going to count the number of blocks that I need in the repeat and the number of rows that I need. And that is just how easy it is to set up a quilt on point. If you like this layout, you can do again and set up a second layout. I'm going to change back to the first pattern. It goes back to the original size, put in 12 inches and 12 inches, hit my enter, and you can see that it did not change. So let me hit my minus on my height and then my plus on my height. Go back to 45 degrees, hit my enter key, give it to me in plus and then give it to me in minus to wake it up a little bit and say okay. That's how you can audition a quilt on point, should you want to do that for a quilt that you have coming in. I was really tickled with this and how I can set it up, and I have spent way too much time playing with these different block patterns to be able to see what a quilt is going to look at. So I hope you find that useful and helpful to you. Thank you for playing Statler with me.